Welcome, dear friends, to a tale that transcends time itself. In the gentle hills of Virginia, where magnolia blossoms whisper secrets to the wind, we shall witness a love story born not from passion's fire, but from honor's quiet flame. Here in the shadows of a nation rebuilding itself, two souls will discover that sometimes the heart's deepest longings are fulfilled not through choice, but through duty, transformed by grace. What stories of redemption and hope echo in your own corner of the world? Tell me in the comments below where you're watching from. I'd love to know. Before we journey together into this world of silk and sorrow, of plantations and prayers, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. Your support helps these timeless stories reach hearts that need them most. The year is 1875. The place is Richmond, Virginia, a city still bearing the scars of war, yet blooming again with tentative hope. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Whitmore mansion like golden honey through fine lace, casting elongated shadows across the Persian carpet where Charlotte stood. Her fingers, pale as winter jasmine, trembled against the mahogany table as Colonel Samuel Whitmore's words settled in the air like dust after a thunderstorm. "The arrangement has been made, my dear child." The grandfather clock in the hallway counted the seconds with metallic precision, each tick a hammer against Charlotte's suddenly fragile composure. She could feel the weight of her black mourning dress, 5 years of grief sewn into every seam, and wondered if this was how butterflies felt before emerging from their cocoons. Terrified yet somehow expectant, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with violets. "Mr. Edward Thornfield is a gentleman of impeccable reputation, Charlotte. His plantation in the Shenandoah Valley flourishes where others have failed." Through the window, Charlotte watched a cardinal settle on the wrought iron fence, its scarlet breast bright against the morning mist. She envied its freedom to fly away, to choose its perch, its mate, its destiny. The bird tilted its head, fixed her with one dark eye, then spread its wings and disappeared into the maze of Richmond's rebuilding streets. "When?" Her voice emerged barely above a whisper, fragile as spun sugar. "The ceremony is arranged for November's end, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church," the colonel replied, his voice carrying the gentle authority that had once commanded Confederate troops. "You shall want for nothing, child. Mr. Thornfield's fortune survived the war intact. Indeed, it has grown." Charlotte's hand found the cameo brooch at her throat, the only remnant of her mother's jewelry collection. The ivory surface was worn smooth by 5 years of anxious fingers, and she wondered if her parents, resting in Oakwood Cemetery, would approve of this transaction disguised as matrimony. But what choice did she have? An orphan without dowry, dependent upon relatives whose own fortunes had been scattered like autumn leaves in Sherman's wake. The arithmetic of survival was stark and unforgiving. "He is kind?" she managed to ask, though the question felt inadequate, like asking if rain was wet or fire warm. Mrs. Whitmore's smile softened the morning shadows. "He has requested nothing more than a gentle companion, dear one. No man reaches 40 unmarried without learning patience." As Charlotte climbed the curved staircase to her room, her hand trailing along the banister her father had once polished with such care, she wondered if patience was enough foundation for a life. Behind her, the grandfather clock continued its relentless counting, measuring out the days until she would become Mrs. Edward Thornfield, a woman whose heart remained a mystery even to herself. The cardinal returned to the fence, and this time Charlotte noticed it was not alone. Edward Thornfield stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the autumn fog roll across the Shenandoah Valley like a silk shawl being drawn over sleeping fields. The plantation stretched before him in neat, prosperous rows, tobacco plants heavy with their final harvest, workers moving with the unhurried rhythm of men who knew their labor was valued and fairly compensated. "The Richmond arrangements proceed smoothly, sir," Benjamin Parker announced from the doorway, his ledger books tucked under his arm like familiar friends. The plantation's administrator had served the Thornfield family since before the war, and his loyalty had been rewarded with prosperity shared rather than hoarded. Edward nodded without turning from the window. At 40, he possessed the kind of weathered handsomeness that spoke of responsibility shouldered early, silver threading his dark hair, lines carved around eyes that had seen too much, yet somehow retained their capacity for hope. "Tell me, Benjamin, what makes a man marriageable?" Edward's question hung in the air like morning mist, unexpected and strangely vulnerable. Benjamin set his ledgers on the mahogany desk and considered his employer with the frankness of old friendship. "I reckon it's the same thing that makes a plantation profitable, Mr. Edward. Good soil, careful tending, and enough faith to plant seeds in uncertain weather." Through the windows, The Blue Ridge Mountains rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with the first blush of winter. Edward had built his life in their shadow, creating abundance from the ashes of war, but abundance shared alone felt hollow as an empty church on Sunday morning. "The young lady, Miss Whitmore, she has known loss," Edward said quietly, his breath fogging the glass. "As have we all." "Yes, sir. Though some carry their losses lighter than others." Benjamin's voice held the gentle wisdom of a man who had watched his employer work himself nearly to death in the years following his parents' passing. "Might be that's what she needs. Not a master, but a fellow traveler." Edward touched the letter in his breast pocket, the one that had arrived from Colonel Whitmore 3 weeks prior. The terms were clear: a marriage of mutual benefit, a joining of her refinement with his stability. What the letter hadn't mentioned was the stirring he felt when he'd glimpsed her likeness, painted on ivory, delicate as a prayer, or the way her eyes seemed to hold depths he found himself wanting to explore. "Have you ever wondered, Benjamin, if loneliness is God's way of preparing the heart for connection?" His administrator smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "Every morning when I wake up next to Mrs. Parker, after 32 years of marriage, I reckon I'm still being prepared." As evening painted the valley in shades of amber and rose, Edward penned his weekly letter to his intended bride. His handwriting was careful, educated, each word chosen like a stone for a foundation that must bear the weight of 2 lives intertwined. "My dear Miss Whitmore, I trust this letter finds you in good health and spirits. The valley wears autumn like a bride wears silk, beautifully, but with the knowledge that transformation lies ahead." He sealed the letter with red wax, pressing his family's signet ring into the warm surface. Tomorrow it would travel the familiar road to Richmond, carrying his hopes like a message in a bottle cast upon uncertain waters. The grandfather clock in the hallway, twin to the one in the Whitmore mansion, struck 9 times, and Edward wondered if somewhere in Richmond, a young woman with eyes like deep water was listening to the same solemn counting of hours between this moment and their shared future. Mrs. Hamilton's dress shop occupied the corner of Grace and 5th Streets, like a jewel box accidentally left in the sunlight, all gleaming windows and whispered promises of transformation. Charlotte stood before the 3-way mirror, surrounded by bolts of silk and satin that seemed to breathe in the afternoon light, filtering through lace curtains. "Turn slightly to the left, my dear," Mrs. Hamilton murmured around a mouthful of pins, her fingers flying over the ivory silk like a pianist executing a complicated sonata. "Mr. Thornfield's measurements were quite precise. He wishes the gown to complement your natural grace rather than eclipse it." Charlotte obeyed, watching her reflection multiply in the mirrors until she seemed to disappear into infinite versions of herself, each one a bride-to-be with secrets hidden behind carefully composed features. The dress was magnificent, layers of silk imported from New York, with seed pearls sewn in patterns that suggested both tradition and restraint. "Such exquisite fabric," sighed Miss Cordelia Manning, perched on the velvet settee like a curious sparrow. The daughter of a prominent Richmond banker, she had arrived with 2 other young ladies of society, ostensibly to offer support, but clearly thirsting for details of Charlotte's romantic fortune. "Indeed," agreed Miss Virginia Ashworth, her fan fluttering with barely contained excitement. "And the Thornfield sapphires. Have you seen them yet, Charlotte? They say his grandmother brought them from England before the Revolution." Charlotte's hand instinctively moved to her throat, where the promised jewels would soon rest. Just yesterday, a velvet box had arrived with a card written in Edward's careful script. "For the lady who will make these stones shine brighter than they ever have before, E.T." "Such a romantic," whispered Miss Eliza Pettigrew, the youngest of the trio at 17. "Imagine being chosen by the most eligible gentleman in 3 counties. If they only knew, Charlotte thought, that choice had played no part in this arrangement. But she smiled graciously, her mother's training in social graces serving her well even in circumstances her mother could never have. "Has requested your presence at the Education Committee meeting at 4 o'clock. Charlotte accepted the papers with a smile of gratitude. Having Rebecca as her assistant provided a living link to the academy and a daily reminder of why her work mattered. The young woman had progressed from struggling to read simple sentences to managing complex administrative responsibilities, proof that educational opportunity could transform. Lives when offered with genuine commitment and adequate resources. "Any word from Mr. Thornfield about his morning meetings?" Charlotte inquired, settling carefully into her desk chair and reviewing the day's agenda. "Yes, ma'am. He's successfully concluded negotiations with the federal representatives. The National Teacher Training Program will be headquartered here in Richmond. with satellite locations in Norfolk, Petersburg, and Lynchburg. He expects to be here by 3 o'clock to escort you home. Charlotte felt a familiar flutter of pride in her husband's accomplishments. Edward had proven himself a gifted administrator and negotiator, able to navigate the complex politics of federal funding while maintaining focus on practical educational outcomes. Together, they had become a formidable team. Her vision and passion combined with his organizational skills and political acumen, creating opportunities that neither could have achieved individually. The afternoon meetings proceeded with the usual combination of progress and frustration that marked governmental work. Senator Morrison, no relation to Jake Morrison or Sarah Morrison, despite the shared surname, proved receptive to increased rural school funding, but insisted on provisions that would have limited educational opportunities for colored children. Charlotte spent an hour carefully but firmly arguing for universal access, drawing on data from the Thornfield Academy to demonstrate the social and economic benefits of inclusive education. Governor Walker's committee meeting focused on teacher certification standards, and Charlotte found herself defending requirements that some members considered unnecessarily rigorous. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the authority that 3 months in office had taught her to project, "we ask teachers to shape young minds, to instill values, to prepare children for productive citizenship. Should we demand less preparation from teachers than we require from blacksmiths or seamstresses?" By 4 o'clock, Charlotte felt the familiar exhaustion that came from conducting professional business while carrying twins who seemed increasingly active as her pregnancy progressed. She was gathering her materials when Edward appeared in the committee room doorway, his presence immediately calming her frazzled nerves. "How did the federal meetings proceed?" she asked as they made their way slowly down the Capitol steps, Edward's hand steady at her elbow. "Better than expected. The funding will be sufficient to train 50 teachers per year initially, with expansion possible based on demonstrated success. And," he paused, his voice carrying suppressed excitement, "they've agreed to make the program a model for similar initiatives throughout the reconstructed South. If we succeed here, Virginia's methods will influence educational policy from Maryland to Texas." Charlotte felt tears prick behind her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming sense of purpose and possibility that had marked their life together. From the small academy serving workers, children in the Shenandoah Valley, to a program that might influence educational opportunities across the entire region, the expansion seemed almost miraculous in its scope and swiftness. Their Richmond house was a modest but elegant townhouse in the Church Hill district, chosen for its proximity to both the Capitol and the school where Edward was establishing his teacher training program. Unlike the spacious grandeur of Thornfield Manor, this house was designed for efficiency and convenience, though Charlotte had decorated it with items from their valley home, paintings of the Blue Ridge Mountains, books from Edward's library, fresh flowers that reminded them of the gardens they had left in Sarah Morrison's capable care. That evening, as they sat together in their small parlor reviewing correspondence from the academy, Charlotte felt one of the babies shift dramatically, creating a visible bulge on one side of her abdomen that made her catch her breath with surprise. "Active tonight," Edward observed, looking up from a letter describing the academy's expanded enrollment, now 47 students ranging from age 6 to 16. "Dr. Patterson says it's normal for twins to be more active as space becomes limited," Charlotte replied, rubbing the spot where tiny feet seemed to be conducting an energetic dance. "He expects birth within the next 4 to 6 weeks." Edward set aside his correspondence and moved to kneel beside Charlotte's chair, placing his hands gently on either side of her rounded belly. Almost immediately, one of the babies responded with a strong kick that made him smile with wonder. "Do you think they'll be boys or girls?" he asked, a question that had occupied their evening conversations for months. "Healthy," Charlotte replied, the answer she always gave. "Everything else is secondary." A soft knock at the front door interrupted their domestic tranquility. Edward rose to answer it, returning with Dr. Patterson himself, his black bag in hand and his usually composed face showing signs of unusual urgency. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said without preamble, "I believe we need to prepare for an earlier arrival than anticipated. The positioning and your symptoms today suggest labor may begin within hours rather than weeks." Charlotte felt a familiar surge of the calm, determination that had carried her through every major challenge in her life. "What do you need us to do?" The next several hours passed in a blur of preparation, pain, and the ancient rhythm of birth that connected Charlotte to countless generations of women, who had faced this threshold between one life and another. Edward remained at her side throughout, offering water, cool cloths, the steady presence that had sustained her through their entire marriage. Dawn was breaking over Richmond when their son arrived first, a lusty cry announcing his protest at being disturbed from his comfortable prenatal quarters. 15 minutes later, their daughter followed with equal vocal vigor, and Charlotte felt the profound exhaustion and inexplicable joy that marked the successful completion of the most important work she would ever do. "Perfect," Dr. Patterson announced, wrapping the babies in soft blankets before placing them in Charlotte's arms. Absolutely perfect. Her son and daughter, both healthy, both eager to make their presence known to the world. Edward sat carefully on the edge of the bed, his arm around Charlotte as they studied their children's tiny faces, features still soft and undefined, but already showing hints of family resemblance. The boy had Edward's dark hair and strong chin, while the girl seemed to favor Charlotte's delicate bone structure and expressive eyes. "Names?" Edward asked softly. Charlotte had been considering this question for months, but now, holding her children and feeling the weight of all the love and sacrifice that had brought them to this moment, the answers came clearly. "James Thomas for my father," she said, touching her son's downy cheek, "and Margaret Rose for my mother." Edward nodded approval, understanding the importance of connecting these new lives to the courage and idealism that had shaped their parents' marriage. "James and Margaret Thornfield," he said, testing the sound of the names. "May they grow up worthy of the legacy they've inherited." As Richmond came fully awake outside their bedroom windows, horses' hooves on cobblestones, vendors calling their wares, the ordinary sounds of a city beginning its daily business, Charlotte reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. From orphaned charity case to wife to mother to the first woman appointed to Virginia's State Board of Education, each transition had required courage, faith, and the willingness to trust in possibilities not yet visible. "What comes next?" Edward asked, echoing her thoughts. Charlotte looked at their children, already showing signs of their individual personalities. James alert and watchful, Margaret contentedly settled against her mother's breast and felt the familiar stirring of hope and purpose that had guided every major decision in her adult life. "Next, we raise them to understand that privilege brings responsibility," she said quietly. "We teach them that education is not just about personal advancement, but about using knowledge to serve others. We show them that love multiplied is stronger than love hoarded, that the circle of honor grows wider when we choose inclusion over exclusion, hope over fear." Edward kissed her forehead gently, his lips warm against her skin. "And we continue the work, the schools, the teacher training, the policy changes that will create opportunities for children like these long after we're gone." Outside, Richmond's church bells began their Sunday morning chorus, and Charlotte imagined the sound carrying across Virginia to the Shenandoah Valley, where Sarah Morrison was preparing for morning services with academy students and their families, to rural communities where newly trained teachers were opening school doors that had never existed before, to the future where James and Margaret Thornfield would inherit a world expanded by their parents' stubborn insistence that love was stronger than fear, hope more durable than despair. The twins stirred in her arms, small fists opening and closing as if already reaching toward the possibilities that awaited them. Charlotte held them close and whispered a prayer of gratitude for Edward's love, for the work they shared, for the mysterious providence that had transformed a marriage of necessity into a partnership of genuine devotion, for these precious lives that represented not just their private joy, but their continuing commitment to building a world worthy of children's dreams. The circle of honor was complete, but like all true circles, it had no end, only the promise of infinite expansion as love begat love, hope encouraged hope, and each generation built upon the foundation laid by those who had chosen courage over comfort, service over safety, the difficult path toward justice over the easy road of indifference. Imagined. Mrs. Hamilton stepped back, her artist's eye critical as she surveyed her work. "The neckline is perfect, demure yet elegant. A true Virginia bride." She pinned a final section of him, her voice dropping to a confidential tone. "I've dressed 3 generations of Thornfield women, dear child. The family appreciates refinement over ostentation, substance over show." The bell above the shop door chimed softly, and Mrs. Margaret Whitmore entered like a ship in full sail, her burgundy velvet dress rustling importantly. "How does our bride progress?" she inquired, her eyes bright with satisfaction as she took in Charlotte's transformed appearance. "Perfectly, Mrs. Whitmore," Charlotte replied, meaning it. Despite the circumstances of her engagement, She found herself taking unexpected pleasure in the ritual of preparation. Perhaps this was how soldiers felt when donning dress uniforms, not happy about the battle ahead, but proud to wear the colors with dignity. As the afternoon wore on, the other ladies departed with promises to attend the ceremony, leaving Charlotte alone with her reflection and the weight of silk that would soon bind her to a man she knew only through courteous letters. She thought of the cardinal pair she'd been watching from her bedroom window, how they had begun to build a nest together in the old magnolia tree, not from passion, but from some deeper instinct toward partnership and survival. Mrs. Hamilton packed the gown carefully in tissue paper and lavender sachets. "Wear it with joy, my dear," she advised, her fingers patting Charlotte's hand with maternal affection. Some of the finest marriages begin with friendship rather than fire. The heart has its own wisdom, given time to listen. Walking home through Richmond's rebuilding streets, Charlotte felt the autumn air sharp against her cheeks and wondered if her heart was brave enough to discover its own wisdom. In 3 weeks she would stand before God and congregation, promising to honor and cherish a stranger whose letters spoke of kindness, but whose touch remained a mystery wrapped in propriety and hope. The sapphires waited in their velvet box, patient as promises. St. Paul's Episcopal Church wore the morning light like a blessing, its Gothic spires reaching toward heaven with the confidence of stone prayers offered by generations of Virginia families. The November air carried the last whispers of autumn, wood smoke and dying leaves, the promise of winter wrapped in golden warmth. Charlotte stood in the bride's chamber, her reflection in the mirror both strange and familiar. The ivory silk gown transformed her into someone she barely recognized, a woman of substance and beauty, worthy of the sapphires that rested cool against her throat. The necklace was even more magnificent than she had imagined, deep blue stones surrounded by diamonds, each gem catching light like captured pieces of twilight. "You are radiant, my dear child," Mrs. Whitmore whispered, adjusting the cathedral-length veil that had belonged to Edward's mother. The lace was yellowed with age but still exquisite, its patterns telling stories of brides who had worn it to this same altar in times of peace and war, prosperity and struggle. Through the chamber window, Charlotte could see the carriages arriving, Richmond's surviving elite dressed in their finest, come to witness this union between old Virginia breeding and new prosperity. She recognized many faces from her childhood, neighbors who had known her parents, friends of her family who now watched from the careful distance that separated charity cases from their social equals. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Charlotte?" The voice belonged to Edward's man, Benjamin Parker, whose kindly eyes and gentle manner had endeared him to her during the brief meetings of preparation. "Mr. Thornfield wishes to know if you are ready." Ready. The word held so many meanings. Ready to leave her childhood behind? Ready to trust her future to a man whose letters were gentle, but whose heart remained uncharted territory? Ready to believe that duty could in time blossom into something deeper? "Yes," she replied, the word emerging stronger than she expected. "I am ready." The processional music began. Bach's Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring played on the ancient pipe organ with reverential precision. Charlotte moved through the sanctuary like a figure in a dream, aware of rustling silk, whispered compliments, the weight of expectations settling around her shoulders like a velvet cloak. At the altar, Edward waited. He was taller than she had expected, his dark suit impeccably tailored, his silver-threaded hair catching the light that streamed through the stained glass windows. But it was his expression that stopped her breath, not the indifferent calculation of a man completing a business transaction, but something softer, more vulnerable. When their eyes met, she saw recognition there, as if he too understood that this moment balanced between obligation and possibility. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God," Reverend Dr. Matthews began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent binding couples in sacred covenant. The familiar words washed over Charlotte like a tide of tradition and grace. When the time came for vows, Edward's voice was steady, each word chosen with the careful precision she had come to associate with his letters. "I, Edward, take thee, Charlotte, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part." Her own vows trembled slightly, but she spoke them clearly, meaning them with a sincerity that surprised her own heart. As Edward slipped the gold band onto her finger, his grandmother's ring, worn smooth by decades of faithfulness, Charlotte felt something shift inside her, like a door opening onto a room she had never seen before. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, Edward lifted her veil with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. The kiss that followed was brief, respectful, but Charlotte detected something beneath the formal courtesy, a gentleness that spoke of possibilities yet unexplored. The autumn light poured through the sanctuary windows, painting them both in shades of gold and amber, as the congregation rose with rustling silk and muted congratulations. They were wed now, bound by law and sacred promise, but Charlotte sensed that their real journey was just beginning, a careful dance between two hearts, learning to trust in the gentle revolution that sometimes transforms duty into devotion. As they walked down the aisle together, Edward's arm steady beneath her gloved hand, Charlotte heard the organ swell with Mendelssohn's Wedding March and wondered if her parents, watching from whatever realm beyond this one, would approve of the woman their daughter was becoming. The sapphires caught the light with each step, their deep blue fire a promise that some treasures grow more beautiful with time. The carriage rolled through the Shenandoah Valley like a ship navigating gentle seas, its wheels finding rhythm with the steady clip of horses' hooves on the macadam road. Charlotte sat beside her new husband, acutely aware of the space between them, not cold but careful, like two dancers learning the steps to an unfamiliar waltz. Edward had shed his formal wedding attire for a practical traveling coat, and Charlotte noticed how the change transformed him from imposing stranger to someone more approachable. He pointed out landmarks along the way, the weathered stone church where his grandfather had worshipped, the mill that ground grain for 3 counties, the covered bridge that had somehow survived both war and flood. The valley has its own rhythm, he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present during their brief courtship meetings in Richmond. Spring comes early here and autumn lingers like a guest reluctant to leave. Through the carriage windows, Charlotte watched the landscape unfold in shades of amber and rust. Mountains rose on either side like protective walls, their peaks touched with the first hint of winter snow. She had never traveled this far from Richmond, and the wild beauty of the place stirred something in her heart that had been sleeping since her parents' death. "It's magnificent," she said simply, meaning it. Edward's smile was quick and genuine. "I hoped you would find it so. Thornfield Manor sits in the heart of it all, close enough to Winchester for society when desired, remote enough for peace when solitude calls." As afternoon shadows lengthened, the carriage turned through gates bearing the Thornfield coat of arms, a oak tree with deep roots, encircled by the motto Fortis et Fidelis, strong and faithful. Charlotte wondered if those words were prophecy or prayer. The manor house rose from its setting like something from a Virginia gentleman's dream, Georgian architecture in mellowed brick, with tall windows that reflected the surrounding mountains and gardens that spoke of careful tending through generations. Smoke curled from several chimneys, promising warmth and welcome. "Home," Edward said quietly, and Charlotte heard something in his voice that made her look at him more closely. He seemed younger somehow, as if the familiar landscape had lifted a burden she hadn't realized he carried. Before the carriage had fully stopped, the front door opened and a woman emerged. Tall, dignified, her silver hair arranged in a style that spoke of someone accustomed to authority. But her smile was warm, genuine as she approached. "You must be Charlotte," she said, her voice carrying the musical cadences of the Virginia Piedmont. "I am Celia Morrison. Though everyone here calls me Aunt Celia, I've been looking forward to meeting Mr. Edward's bride." Edward helped Charlotte from the carriage, his hand steady at her elbow. "Aunt Celia has managed Thornfield's domestic arrangements since before I was born," he explained. "She knows where everything is and how everything should be done. I merely provide the signature on the household accounts." Celia's laugh was rich and musical. "Don't let him fool you, Miss Charlotte. Mr. Edward runs this plantation like a symphony conductor, every note in its proper place, every instrument valued for its contribution." As they climbed the front steps, Charlotte noticed the subtle signs of prosperity and care. The brass door fittings polished to mirror brightness, the carved woodwork restored to its original beauty, flower boxes filled with late-blooming chrysanthemums that nodded in the evening breeze. The interior of the manor was even more impressive, high ceilings with ornate plasterwork, Persian rugs over polished heart-pine floors, furniture that spoke of quality inherited and maintained across generations. But it was the touches of personal taste that caught Charlotte's attention, fresh flowers in every room, books lying open as if recently read, a sense of active life rather than museum preservation. "I've prepared the rose chamber for you," Edward said, his voice carefully neutral. Until you feel established here, you should have your privacy. The morning light is particularly fine there, and it overlooks the gardens." Charlotte felt a flutter of something, relief mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Gratitude perhaps for his consideration, but also a strange disappointment that he so easily accepted their separate arrangements. As Celia led her upstairs, chattering about the household routines and the names of the staff, Charlotte caught glimpses through open doorways of Edward's private study, his bedroom with its massive mahogany bed and military campaign chest, the gun room with its collection of hunting rifles, and the portraits of Thornfield ancestors who seemed to watch her progress with expressions of reserved approval. The rose chamber was everything Edward had promised, spacious and feminine, with wallpaper in delicate pink damask, a four-poster bed draped in cream-colored silk, and windows that framed the valley like living paintings. A fire crackled in the marble hearth, and someone had placed fresh roses in a crystal vase on the writing desk. "Mr. Edward had this room redecorated for you," Celia explained, smoothing an already perfect bed cover. "He spent considerable time with the decorators, wanting everything to be just so. She should feel welcome," he kept saying. "She should feel at home." As Charlotte stood at the window watching the last light fade from the mountains, she wondered if home was something that could be gifted, or if it must be earned through the slow accumulation of shared days and gentle understanding. Somewhere in the house below, she heard Edward's voice conferring with Benjamin about the next day's work, and the sound was oddly comforting. The voice of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, who built his life on the foundation of care extended to others. Perhaps, Charlotte thought as she prepared for her first night as Mrs. Edward Thornfield, home was not a place but a promise, the promise that two people could create something together that neither could achieve alone. The morning arrived dressed in frost and revelation. Charlotte woke to find her breath visible in the rose chamber's golden light, despite the banked fire in the hearth. From her windows the valley spread below like a tapestry, woven from mist and dying leaves, and she could see Edward in the distance, walking among the workers with the easy authority of a man comfortable in his responsibilities. A soft knock interrupted her morning reverie. "Come in," she called, expecting Celia with morning tea. Instead, Edward appeared in the doorway, his expression more serious than she had yet seen. He held a leather portfolio in his hands, and his usual composed demeanor seemed touched with something she couldn't identify. Regret, perhaps, or the weight of difficult truth. "Charlotte," he began, then stopped, running his hand through his hair in a gesture that made him seem younger, more vulnerable. "There are matters we must discuss. Things you should know about your parents' death, about why I asked Colonel Whitmore for your hand." The frost outside suddenly seemed to penetrate the room itself. Charlotte felt her knees weaken, and she sank into the chair by the window, her morning wrapper pulling close around her like armor that might prove inadequate. "My parents died in a carriage accident," she said carefully, "on their way to conduct business in the capital." Edward's face was grave as he opened the portfolio, revealing yellowed documents and correspondence. The business they traveled to conduct involved exposing a scheme, a conspiracy to defraud veterans of their land grants. Men who had fought for Virginia were being systematically cheated of the property promised them by the government. He moved to the window, staring out at his own prosperous acres. "Your father discovered that someone was falsifying documentation, selling the same plots to multiple buyers, keeping the profits while leaving honest soldiers with worthless paper. He and your mother were traveling to present evidence to the authorities when their carriage overturned in the Blue Ridge Pass." Charlotte's hand found the cameo at her throat, her mother's cameo, and pressed it like a talisman against the rising tide of questions. "You think it was not an accident?" "I know it was not." Edward's voice was quiet but certain. "The investigation was brief, inadequate. Too many important people had too much to lose if your father's evidence came to light. The matter was buried with your parents." The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of Charlotte's heart beating against her ribs like a caged bird. Outside, she could hear the normal sounds of plantation life, workers calling to each other, horses neighing in the stables, the distant lowing of cattle. But these homely sounds seemed suddenly fragile, as if the evil Edward described could shatter such innocent peace. "Why are you telling me this?" she whispered. Edward turned from the window, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not pity, but a fierce protectiveness that transformed his features from handsome to arresting. "Because 3 months ago, my investigators finally identified the man responsible. Jake Morrison, a small-time criminal with connections to certain business associates who preferred to remain unnamed. He bribed your parents' coachman, weakened the carriage wheels, and ensured that their journey would end in tragedy." Charlotte rose from her chair, moving to the fireplace where she gripped the mantel for support. "And this Morrison, where is he now?" "In custody. He will face justice for his crimes." Edward's voice carried satisfaction, but also something deeper, the weight of a man who understood that justice, however necessary, could never restore what had been lost. "You married me out of guilt," Charlotte said, the words emerging flat and factual. Edward crossed the room in 3 quick strides, stopping just close enough that she could see the silver threads in his dark hair, smell the scent of leather and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. I married you because your parents were murdered, trying to protect innocent people, and you deserved better than to live as anyone's dependent charity case. But also, he paused, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, because from the moment I saw your likeness, read your letters, observed your dignity in circumstances that would crush a lesser spirit, I knew that my life would be immeasurably enriched by your presence in it. Charlotte stared into the fire, watching the flames dance like memories she couldn't quite grasp. What happens now? Now we decide who we choose to be, Edward replied. Your parents died fighting for justice and truth. Morrison will pay for his crimes, and the money recovered from his schemes has been placed in trust to compensate the families he wronged. We can let their legacy end there, or we can build something that honors their memory, something that protects others as they try to protect those veterans. She turned to face him then, this man who had wed her carrying the weight of such terrible knowledge, and saw in his eyes not the calculating stranger she had feared, but someone whose heart had been marked by grief and shaped by the determination to transform suffering into service. Show me, she said simply. Show me how we honor them. The frost was melting on the windows now, and somewhere in the valley below, Charlotte heard the sound of children's voices raised in play. Workers' children, perhaps, who would grow up on Thornfield land, with opportunities her parents had died trying to secure for others. For the first time since waking, Charlotte felt warm. The Richmond Episcopal Church rectory smelled of beeswax candles and old leather prayer books, its atmosphere thick with decades of confessions heard and burdens shared. Charlotte sat in Reverend Dr. Matthews's study, her traveling dress folded carefully around her, like the wings of a bird seeking sanctuary from an unexpected storm. 3 days had passed since Edward's revelation, 3 days during which she had moved through the routines of Thornfield Manor, like a sleepwalker navigating familiar rooms in the dark. She had taken meals with polite conversation, walked in the gardens with appropriate admiration for their beauty, and retired each night to the rose chamber, where sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of carriage wheels and mountain pea, passes and voices calling her name from distances too great to bridge. I need time to think, she had told Edward that morning, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. To pray, to understand what God intends for us now. He had arranged her transportation to Richmond without question, his face grave but accepting. Stay as long as you need, he had said, pressing a small velvet purse into her hands. But know that Thornfield waits for you, and so do I. Now Reverend Matthews poured tea with the deliberate care of a man accustomed to offering comfort through ritual and presence. His hair was silver white, his face lined with the accumulated compassion of 40 years in ministry, and his eyes held the gentle authority of someone who had guided countless souls through the wilderness of difficult choices. Marriage is a peculiar sacrament, he said, settling into the chair across from Charlotte, with a soft grunt of elderly joints. It asks us to promise fidelity to someone we may not yet fully know, to trust that God's grace will provide what human understanding cannot. Charlotte accepted the teacup with hands that trembled slightly. But how can I trust what was built on deception? How can I know if his feelings are genuine, or merely the product of guilt and obligation? Ah, the Reverend smiled. The eternal question of the human heart. How do we distinguish between duty and love? But perhaps, my dear child, you are asking the wrong question. Through the study windows, Charlotte could see the familiar streets of Richmond, the city where she had grown up, fallen into orphanhood, and been transformed from charity case to bride in the space of 3 months. The autumn light seemed different here, harsher, more demanding than the golden softness that bathed the Shenandoah Valley. What question should I be asking? Not whether Mr. Thornfield's initial motivations were pure. We are all of us creatures of mixed motives, acting from combinations of selfishness and sacrifice, fear and faith. The question is, what has he shown you of his character in the time you have spent together? What do his actions reveal about the man he chooses to be? Charlotte set down her teacup and considered. Edward had received her at Thornfield with gentle courtesy, given her privacy and space to adjust to her new circumstances. He had shared his painful knowledge not to salve his own conscience, but because he believed she deserved truth over comfortable lies. His household ran with the efficiency of a man who treated his responsibilities seriously, and his workers, both field hands and domestic staff, spoke of him with respect rather than fear. He could have married anyone, she said slowly, working through her thoughts aloud. Any number of Virginia's daughters would have brought him alliance with important families, larger dowries, social advancement. Yet he chose you. Why? The question hung in the air like incense, sweet and challenging. Charlotte rose and walked to the window, watching carriages pass on the cobblestones below. He said his life would be enriched by my presence, that I deserved better than dependence on others' charity. Actions flowing from such motivations are not common in this world, Charlotte. Most men, faced with the knowledge that they could profit from another's tragedy, would comfort themselves with the thought that business is business, that the strong naturally prey upon the weak. Instead, Mr. Thornfield spent his own resources to investigate, to bring a criminal to justice, to compensate the victims of fraud, and then offered you partnership rather than patronage. Charlotte touched her reflection in the window glass, seeing not the uncertain girl who had fled Thornfield 3 days ago, but a woman whose life had been touched by genuine sacrifice, offered without expectation of return. The heart has seasons like the earth, Reverend Matthews continued. What appears barren in winter may bloom magnificently in spring, but only if we are willing to tend the soil and trust in the process. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Charlotte knelt in the small church sanctuary, her prayers less desperate now, more focused. She thought of Edward walking alone through his prosperous acres, wondering if she would return to share the burden and blessing of his life. She thought of her parents, their courage in the face of corruption, their willingness to risk everything for the sake of strangers who deserved justice. And she thought of the children's voices she had heard from her window at Thornfield, free children, growing up with opportunities her parents had died trying to protect. When she rose from the prie-dieu, Charlotte knew she had found her answer. Not certainty about the future, but clarity about the choice she faced. She could remain safe in the familiar confinement of Richmond Charity, or she could return to the valley and discover what kind of woman she was capable of becoming. That evening she penned a brief letter. Edward, I am coming home. Your devoted wife, Charlotte. Tomorrow, she would return to Thornfield Manor, not as a refugee seeking sanctuary, but as a partner prepared to build something worthy of the love and sacrifice that had brought them together. The autumn light through the sanctuary windows seemed suddenly golden, full of promise. Charlotte's return to Thornfield Manor was heralded not by fanfare, but by the simple, profound sight of Edward, waiting on the front steps, as her carriage rounded the curve of the drive. He wore no formal coat, just shirt sleeves rolled up despite the November chill, and his face carried an expression of such mingled hope and anxiety that Charlotte felt her heart contract with unexpected tenderness. He handed her down from the carriage with careful courtesy, but she noticed how his fingers lingered over hers, how his eyes searched her face for signs of her decision. "Welcome home," he said simply, and the word home fell between them like a bridge finally completed after long construction. "I owe you an apology," Charlotte said as they walked up the steps together, "for leaving so abruptly, for doubting your intentions when your actions have shown nothing but kindness." Edward paused at the threshold, his hand on the heavy oak door. "You owe me nothing, Charlotte. You needed time to think, to choose freely. I would not have you stay from obligation alone." Inside the manor, Aunt Celia bustled forward, with exclamations of welcome, but Charlotte barely heard the domestic chatter. She was aware only of Edward's presence beside her, the way he moved through his house with quiet confidence, the careful attention he paid to her comfort, without making her feel like a guest in need of management. That evening, they dined together for the first time since their wedding, not in the formal dining room with its imposing portraits and heavy silver, but in the smaller family dining room, where candlelight made conversation intimate rather than ceremonial. "Tell me about the plantation," Charlotte said, cutting her roasted pheasant with the delicate precision her finishing school had taught her. "How did you manage to prosper when so many others failed after the war?" Edward's face became animated, the reserved courtesy giving way to genuine enthusiasm, diversification primarily. While others struggled to maintain the old tobacco monoculture with free rather than enslaved labor, I planted cotton, grain, vegetables, whatever the land would support. And I paid fair wages from the beginning, which meant my workers stayed when they could have left. The men I see in the fields, are they all former? Some, Edward replied carefully. About half are freedmen who chose to remain and work for wages. The others are European immigrants, Irish, German, some Italians, men seeking opportunity in a new country. They work side by side, and their children attend the same school I've established on the property. Charlotte set down her fork, surprised. "You have a school?" "Just a small building near the workers' quarters. Miss Sarah Hartwell comes from Winchester 3 days a week to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic. About 20 children attend regularly." Edward's voice carried pride mixed with something else, a quiet satisfaction that spoke of work done not for recognition, but for the simple rightness of it. After dinner, they walked in the garden despite the chill in the air. The formal beds were dormant now, prepared for winter's rest, but even in their emptiness they spoke of careful planning and patient cultivation. Charlotte found herself drawing parallels to her marriage, still in its winter phase, but with the infrastructure in place for future blooming. "Why did you never marry before?" she asked, pulling her shawl closer as they paused beside a fountain that tinkled softly in the darkness. Edward was quiet for a long moment, his breath visible in small puffs in the cold air. "I suppose I was waiting for someone who would share my vision, rather than simply benefit from my prosperity. Too many of the young ladies I met in Richmond or Winchester seemed more interested in the Thornfield fortune than the man who had built it. And you thought I would be different because I had no choice in the matter." He turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "I thought you would be different because of how you bore your circumstances. Aunt Celia made inquiries, before I approached your uncle. She learned that you never complained about your reduced status, never sought to use your parents' tragedy to gain sympathy or advantage. You worked as a genuine companion to your aunt, tutored the younger children in the neighborhood without payment, visited the sick with the church ladies. Character reveals itself in adversity, Charlotte, and yours shone." They had reached the center of the garden, where a small gazebo provided shelter from the November wind. Edward offered his arm, and Charlotte noticed how natural the gesture felt, how her hand seemed to fit perfectly in the crook of his elbow. "I have been thinking," she said carefully, "about what we might build together, if you are willing." "I am willing to hear anything you wish to share." Charlotte took a deep breath, surprised by her own boldness. "The school you mentioned, could it be expanded, made more formal? I had excellent teachers in Richmond before my parents died. I could assist Miss Hartwell, or even take full responsibility for the children's education if she prefers to return to Winchester." Edward's step faltered slightly. "You would want to teach workers' children." "I would want to teach all children, workers' children, farmers' children, any child whose parents desire education but cannot afford it. My parents died trying to protect people's rights to the land they had earned. Perhaps we could honor their memory by ensuring those same people's children have the tools to make the most of their opportunities." They had stopped walking now, standing face to face in the small gazebo, while the night wind rustled through the bare branches of the surrounding trees. Edward reached up and touched her face with his fingertips, the gesture so tender that Charlotte felt tears prick behind her eyes. "You are an extraordinary woman, Charlotte Thornfield." She noticed that he used her married name, and the sound of it in his voice made something flutter to life in her chest, not the desperate passion of novels, but something quieter and perhaps more durable, the beginning of partnership, of shared purpose, of two lives choosing to intertwine, not from desperation but from hope. When he kissed her this time, there in the garden with the mountains standing sentinel around them, Charlotte felt the last of her resistance dissolve like morning frost in sunlight. She was home, not just at Thornfield Manor, but in the circle of Edward's arms, in the warmth of his regard, in the promise of work they would do together to make the world a little more just, a little more kind. The fountain continued its gentle music, and somewhere in the distance, Charlotte heard the sound of night birds calling to their mates, a reminder that even in the darkness, connection was possible for those brave enough to reach across the spaces that separated heart from heart. Spring arrived at Thornfield Manor like a shy debutante, making her entrance at a society ball, tentatively at first, then with increasing confidence as the Virginia sun coaxed daffodils from the still cool earth and painted the Blue Ridge Mountains in shades of tender green. Charlotte stood at her classroom window, watching her students practice their letters on slate boards in the sunshine, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed in just 6 months of marriage. The Thornfield Academy, as Edward had formally named the school, occupied a charming brick building that had once served as the plantation's overseer house. With the addition of large windows, fresh paint, and cheerful yellow shutters, it had been transformed into an inviting center of learning that served not only the workers' children, but also the offspring of small farmers from the surrounding valleys. "Mrs. Charlotte, how do you spell determination?" asked Lucy Morrison, a bright-eyed girl of 10 whose father worked in the tobacco fields. Her earnest face was smudged with chalk dust, and her carefully mended dress spoke of a family that valued education even when prosperity remained elusive. "Determination," Charlotte replied, writing the word in careful script on the blackboard. "And can you tell me what it means?" "It means not giving up even when things get hard. piped up Samuel Parker, Benjamin's youngest son, who at 8 already showed signs of his father's practical wisdom. Excellent, Charlotte smiled. And who can give me an example of determination? Mary O'Sullivan, daughter of one of the Irish field hands, raised her hand eagerly. My papa says Mrs. Charlotte showed determination when she decided to teach us, even though some fancy ladies might think it improper. Charlotte felt warmth bloom in her chest, not embarrassment, but pride in these children, who understood far more than their young years might suggest. It was true that her decision to personally oversee the academy had raised eyebrows among Richmond society. Mrs. Hamilton, the dressmaker, had clucked disapprovingly over Charlotte's unconventional notions, and Miss Cordelia Manning had written a concerned letter, wondering if plantation life had affected Charlotte's understanding of proper social boundaries. But Edward had supported her completely, even going so far as to purchase advanced textbooks from Baltimore and hiring Mr. James Fletcher, a young graduate of Washington College, to assist with mathematics and natural sciences for the older students. Children, Charlotte announced, please put away your slates and gather round the reading circle. Today we shall continue with The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. As 23 eager faces arranged themselves on the carpet before her chair, Charlotte felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered. These children, some the grandchildren of slaves, others the children of immigrants seeking new opportunities, all of them hungry for learning, represented hope made tangible. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows as Charlotte read Washington Irving's atmospheric tale, changing her voice for different characters and watching her students' eyes widen with delicious terror at the description of the headless horseman. When the lesson concluded, the children filed out in orderly fashion, chattering excitedly about the story and their plans for after-school adventures. Charlotte was gathering her materials when she looked up to find Edward standing in the doorway, his shoulder against the frame, a slight smile playing around his lips. He wore his working clothes, leather boots, practical trousers, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and carried in his hands a small bouquet of wildflowers. "How long have you been listening?" she asked, rising to meet him. "Long enough to hear you bring Ichabod Crane to vivid life," he replied, offering her the flowers. "The children adore you, you know. Benjamin tells me that several parents have approached him about sending younger siblings to the academy next term." Charlotte buried her face in the simple bouquet, black-eyed Susans, Queen Anne's lace, wild roses, and breathed in their sweet fragrance. "Mr. Fletcher believes we could accommodate up to 40 students with another teacher and a small addition to the building. Then we shall build an addition," Edward said simply, as if expanding educational opportunities for rural children was as natural as planting crops or mending fences. They walked home together through the golden afternoon, Edward's hand warm against the small of Charlotte's back, as they navigated the path that led from the academy to the main house. The gesture was casual, natural, speaking of an intimacy that had grown gradually from shared meals, evening conversations, and the 1,000 small considerations that marked their daily life together. "I received a letter from Colonel Whitmore today," Edward mentioned as they paused at the garden gate. "He extends an invitation for us to attend the Richmond Spring Cotillion next month." Charlotte considered this, twirling one of the wildflowers between her fingers. "Would you like to go?" "Only if you wish it. I confess that Richmond society holds less attraction for me now than it once did. I find I prefer our quiet evenings here, reading aloud by the fire, discussing the day's work, planning improvements for the plantation and the school." The admission sent a flutter of pleasure through Charlotte's heart. In the months since her return from the rectory, their relationship had evolved from polite partnership to something deeper and more comfortable. They shared not passionate declarations like the lovers in romantic novels, but something perhaps more precious, the quiet compatibility of two people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company, who found in their union not the storm of consuming desire, but the steady warmth of mutual respect and growing affection. "I think," Charlotte said carefully, "that I too prefer our quiet evenings. Though perhaps we might invite the Parkers for dinner next Sunday. I would like to thank them properly for their friendship, and Mary Parker has been such help with organizing the academy's supplies." Edward's smile was warm with approval. "An excellent suggestion. Aunt Celia will be delighted to show off her cooking to appreciative guests." As they walked up the path to the manor house, Charlotte noticed how the late afternoon light caught the silver in Edward's hair, how his face had lost some of the drawn tension she remembered from their early meetings. He looked, she realized, like a man at peace with his choices, and she felt a corresponding peace in her own heart. The Thornfield Academy had given her purpose, But it was Edward's steady support, his quiet encouragement, his obvious pride in her accomplishments, that had given her the confidence to become fully herself. In teaching those eager children, she had discovered not just her own capabilities, but also the joy that came from building something meaningful alongside a partner who valued her contributions. That evening, as they sat together in Edward's study, their study, now since Charlotte's books and writing desk had found permanent places among his leather-bound volumes and plantation ledgers, she looked up from her lesson plans to find him watching her with an expression of quiet contentment. "Thank you," she said impulsively. "For what?" "For seeing who I could become, even when I couldn't see it myself." Edward set aside his correspondence and came to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "My dear Charlotte, you have exceeded every hope I dared harbor when I first wrote to Colonel Whitmore. You have transformed not just our home but our entire community. The children speak of their teacher with reverence usually reserved for saints, and He paused, his voice catching slightly. "I find myself falling in love with my own wife more deeply with each passing day." The words hung in the air like evening song, simple and profound. Charlotte felt tears prick back, not tears of sadness but of recognition. What had begun as duty and grown into partnership was blossoming finally into love, the quiet, sturdy kind that built lives rather than merely inspiring sonnets. Outside, the evening sounds of Thornfield surrounded them. Workers calling goodnight to each other, horses whickering in the stables, the distant sound of children's laughter as families gathered for supper. It was the music of community, of lives intertwined in purpose and hope, and Charlotte realized that she and Edward had become not just husband and wife, but co-creators of something larger than themselves. When he kissed her then, soft and sure in the lamplight of their shared study, Charlotte tasted not passion's fire but something deeper, the sweetness of coming fully home. The morning that would reshape Charlotte's understanding of her past arrived with deceptive tranquility. She was in the garden, harvesting the last of the summer herbs for Aunt Celia's kitchen, when Mr. Samuel Peterson arrived from Richmond bearing legal documents and expressions of barely contained excitement. Edward emerged from his study to greet the lawyer, his face darkening as he read the official papers. Charlotte watched from the herb garden as the two men conferred in low, urgent voices on the front porch, and she felt a familiar chill of foreboding, the same sensation that had preceded every major upheaval in her life. "Charlotte," Edward called, his voice carefully controlled. "Would you join us, please?" She approached with herb-stained fingers and growing apprehension, noting how Mr. Peterson's eyes held the particular gleam of a man delivering dramatic news. His black coat and formal bearing seemed out of place in the informal atmosphere of Thornfield's morning routine. "Mrs. Thornfield," he began with a slight bow, "I bring significant developments regarding the Morrison case and certain related matters that directly concern your family's tragedy." Edward gestured toward the porch chairs. "Perhaps we should sit." As they arranged themselves in the morning shade, Mr. Peterson opened his leather portfolio with theatrical precision. "Jake Morrison has proven remarkably forthcoming during his imprisonment. Faced with the prospect of hanging for murder, he has named his confederates and provided detailed testimony about the land speculation scheme." Charlotte felt Edward's hand find hers, solid and reassuring. "What has he revealed?" "The conspiracy was more extensive than we initially suspected. Morrison was employed by a Richmond-based syndicate that included 3 prominent businessmen, a clerk in the state land office, and—" Peterson paused dramatically. "A member of the Virginia legislature." The morning suddenly seemed too bright, too clear. Charlotte found herself studying the pattern of light and shadow on the porch boards, anything to avoid thinking about the implications of such high-level corruption. "The evidence your parents gathered would have exposed them all," Peterson continued. "Morrison confessed that his instructions were to prevent that evidence from reaching the authorities by any means necessary. He chose the most permanent solution." Edward's grip on Charlotte's hand tightened. "What about prosecution? Justice for Charlotte's parents? 3 of the conspirators have already fled Virginia. The legislator, I shall not name him publicly until trial, has resigned his seat and is cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced charges. The court has ruled that all property acquired through fraudulent means must be restored to its rightful owners, with damages paid from the conspirators' assets." Charlotte found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "And Morrison himself?" "Will hang for murder within the month." Peterson's tone was matter-of-fact, professional. "However, there is more. Morrison's confession revealed that he has a daughter, Sarah Morrison, age 16, who has been working as a seamstress in Winchester. The girl knew nothing of her father's crimes and has lived honestly on her own wages since he abandoned the family 2 years ago. The herb basket slipped from Charlotte's lap, scattering late roses and sprigs of rosemary across the porch floor. The scents rose around them like a benediction, sweet and aromatic, a sharp contrast to the harsh realities being discussed. "Why do you tell us about the daughter?" Edward asked quietly. Peterson smiled slightly. "Because Morrison has requested that his final act be one of restitution. He has signed documents transferring what little he legally owned to his daughter, but more importantly, he has asked specifically that Charlotte Whitmore Thornfield be informed of the girl's circumstances and location. He expressed hope that Christian mercy might extend to an innocent child whose only crime was having him as a father." Charlotte rose abruptly and walked to the porch railing, staring out at the peaceful acres of Thornfield without seeing them. She thought of her parents, their kindness to strangers, their commitment to justice, their willingness to risk everything to protect people they had never met. What would they want her to do now? "Where is the girl currently?" she asked without turning around. "Living in a boarding house in Winchester, supporting herself with needlework. By all accounts, she is industrious and well-behaved, but her situation is precarious. When word spreads of her father's crimes, her current employment may become untenable." Edward joined Charlotte at the railing, his presence solid and comforting. "What are you thinking?" he asked quietly. Charlotte turned to face both men, her decision crystallizing like sugar in cooling syrup. "I am thinking that my parents died trying to protect innocent people from Jake Morrison's crimes. If we turn our backs on his innocent daughter, we make their sacrifice meaningless. You want to help her?" Edward's voice held no surprise, only quiet pride. "I want to offer her a place here if she will accept it. Employment, certainly. Aunt Celia could use assistance with the household duties, and Miss Sarah could help with the academy if she has the inclination and ability. But more than employment," Charlotte paused, searching for the right words, "she could have a home, a family willing to judge her by her own actions rather than her father's crimes." Peterson closed his portfolio with a snap. "A remarkable gesture, Mrs. Thornfield. I shall draft the correspondence immediately, informing Miss Morrison of your offer." As the lawyer's carriage rolled down the drive an hour later, Charlotte and Edward remained on the porch, processing the morning's revelations. The herb basket sat forgotten between them, its contents withering in the late summer heat. "Are you certain about this course?" Edward asked. "Taking in Morrison's daughter will raise questions, perhaps criticism." Charlotte considered this, then shook her head. "I am tired of living my life according to other people's expectations of what is proper or prudent. My parents taught me that true nobility lies in how we treat those who can do nothing for us in return. This girl has lost everything through no fault of her own, just as I once lost everything. If we can offer her what others offered me, redemption, opportunity, the chance to become who she was meant to be, then perhaps some good can come from all this tragedy." Edward's smile was soft with understanding. "Then we shall write to Miss Morrison today, extending the invitation. And if she accepts, we shall prepare the Rose guest room. It seems to have a talent for sheltering young women who need time to discover their place in the world." As they walked back into the house together, Charlotte felt a profound sense of rightness about their decision. The circle of pain and loss that had begun with her parents' murder was being transformed into something else, a circle of grace, of redemption offered and accepted, of love multiplied rather than diminished by sharing. Outside, the herbs in the forgotten basket released their fragrance into the afternoon air, a reminder that even broken things could offer beauty to the world. The Richmond City Jail squatted like a grey stone toad beside the James River, its walls stained with decades of weather and human misery. Charlotte adjusted her dark blue cloak as she and Edward approached the forbidding entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that seemed to echo from the iron-barred windows above. Sarah Morrison walked beside them, her young face pale but resolute. In the 3 months since she had accepted Charlotte's offer of sanctuary at Thornfield Manor, the girl had bloomed like a flower, transplanted from rocky soil to rich earth. Her auburn hair was now neatly styled, her grey dress of good fabric and proper cut. But it was the change in her bearing that marked the deepest transformation, from the hunched shoulders of someone expecting cruelty to the straight spine of a young woman learning to believe in her own worth. "Are you certain you wish to do this?" Edward asked Charlotte quietly as they paused before the heavy oak door. "No one would fault you for maintaining your distance." Charlotte touched the cameo at her throat, her mother's cameo worn smooth by years of anxious fingers. "I need to see him, Edward, to speak the words that must be spoken if I am ever to be truly free of the past." The guard who admitted them was a grizzled veteran with kind eyes who had served under Edward during the final year of the war. He treated them with respectful courtesy, but could not disguise his disapproval of their mission. "He's to hang tomorrow at dawn," he informed them soberly. "Father Mackenzie has been with him regular-like, but he ain't had any other visitors. Most folks figure he's got nothing worth hearing." The cell that housed Jake Morrison was a narrow stone chamber lit by a single barred window high in the wall. The man who looked up at their approach bore little resemblance to the threatening figure Charlotte had imagined. Morrison was small, grey-haired, with the soft features of someone who had lived by cunning rather than strength. Prison had reduced him further. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen his own ending approach with mathematical certainty. "Miss Sarah," he said, rising from his crude wooden bench with an awkward attempt at dignity. "You came." Sarah stepped closer to the bars, her voice steady despite the tears that traced silent paths down her cheeks. "I came to say goodbye, Papa, and to tell you," she paused, struggling with words, "to tell you that I forgive you for leaving Mama and me to fend for ourselves, for the shame your choices have brought to our name, for making me afraid to tell people who my father was." Morrison's face crumpled like paper touched by flame. "Sarah, my girl, I never meant. I was trying to make enough money to come back for you, to give you a proper life. But everything went wrong and then it got worse. And I couldn't find my way back to being the man who deserved to be your papa." Charlotte felt Edward's hand warm against her elbow as she stepped forward. Morrison's eyes widened with recognition, and she saw him recoil slightly, as if her presence brought the weight of his crimes into sharper focus. "I am Charlotte Whitmore," she said clearly. "Now, Charlotte Thornfield, you killed my parents." The words hung in the damp air of the jail like incense heavy with import. Morrison's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, his hands gripping the iron bars until his knuckles showed white. "Yes, ma'am, I did. And I've got no excuse that would satisfy God or man for what I done. Your mama and papa were good people trying to do right, and I stopped them because evil men paid me to stop them, and because I was too much of a coward to find an honest way to make my living." Charlotte moved closer to the bars, close enough to see the lines of regret carved deep around Morrison's eyes, the grey stubble that covered his sunken cheeks. "Why are you telling Sarah about our connection? What did you hope to accomplish?" Morrison's laugh was bitter, without humour. "I reckon I hoped that someone who'd lost as much as she has might understand, might find it in her heart to show her some kindness. Not because she deserves punishment for my sins, but because she deserves better than what life's given her so far. And if I had chosen vengeance instead of mercy, if I had turned her away to fend for herself in a world that will judge her by your crimes," the condemned man's face went even paler, "then I'd have been responsible for destroying one more innocent life before they put the rope around my neck, and I'd have deserved every moment of knowing it." Charlotte felt something shift inside her chest, not the lightning bolt transformation of romantic novels, but something quieter and perhaps more profound. The knot of anger and grief that had lived beneath her breastbone for 6 years loosened, not disappearing entirely, but changing shape, becoming something she could carry without it carrying her. "Jake Morrison," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I forgive you for murdering my parents, not because you deserve it, but because they would want me to carry love forward into the world rather than hatred. Your daughter Sarah is a fine young woman who works hard and treats everyone with kindness. She will make her own way in the world, judged by her own actions rather than yours." Morrison sank to his knees before the bars, his face buried in his hands. "Oh, miss, oh God, I don't deserve such grace from you." "None of us deserve grace," Charlotte replied gently. "That's what makes it grace." As they prepared to leave, Sarah knelt beside her father's cell and pressed a small wrapped bundle through the bars. "Molasses cookies," she said softly, "like Mama used to make. I thought you might remember being happy just for a moment." The walk back through Richmond's streets was conducted mostly in silence, each of them processing the weight of what had just occurred. Sarah walked between Charlotte and Edward, no longer the frightened girl who had arrived at Thornfield, but not yet fully the confident woman she was becoming. "What happens now?" Sarah asked as their carriage rolled toward the train station. "Now you continue building the life you've chosen," Charlotte replied. "You teach the children at our academy. You help Aunt Celia with her household duties. You read the books in Edward's library and decide what kind of woman you want to become. Your father's choices end with him, or your choices begin with you." As the train carried them back toward the Shenandoah Valley and home, Charlotte watched the Virginia countryside roll past and felt a profound sense of completion. The circle of pain that had begun with her parents' death had been closed not with vengeance, but with the kind of transformative mercy that created new possibilities where none had existed before. Beside her, Sarah dozed against the window, her young face peaceful in sleep, and Charlotte thought of how mysterious were the workings of Providence, that Jake Morrison's final act of destroying innocence had somehow, through the alchemy of forgiveness, created the conditions for new innocence to flourish. The train's rhythm was soothing, carrying them home to Thornfield Manor, where Edward's vision and Charlotte's hope were building something that honored the past while refusing to be imprisoned by it. Tomorrow Jake Morrison would meet his earthly justice, but today his daughter was free to discover the woman she was meant to become. And Charlotte Thornfield, née Whitmore, was finally free to live forward rather than backward, to love without reservation, to build rather than merely survive. The circle was complete, but the story, their story, was just beginning. 3 years had passed since that grey morning at Richmond City Jail, and the Thornfield Academy had grown from Charlotte's modest dream into a reality that drew visitors from across Virginia and beyond. The original brick building had been joined by 2 additional structures, one housing the expanded classrooms and a proper library, the other containing workshops where older students learned practical trades alongside their academic subjects. Charlotte stood in the central courtyard, watching her pupils demonstrate their skills for a delegation from the Virginia State Board of Education. Near the vegetable gardens, 12-year-old Samuel Parker explained crop rotation principles to the distinguished gentleman with the serious demeanor of a professor delivering a university lecture. In the shade of the oak trees, Sarah Morrison, now Miss Morrison, head teacher and Charlotte's invaluable partner, guided a group of younger children through an oral recitation of poetry that would have impressed the most discerning Richmond salon. "Remarkable," murmured Senator John Sherman, adjusting his spectacles as he observed a mixed group of white and colored children working together on a mathematics problem. "I confess, Mrs. Thornfield, when your husband first described your educational philosophy, I harbored skepticism about its practical applications. This demonstration has thoroughly converted me." Charlotte smoothed her dark green dress, practical wool rather than the silk finery of her wedding day, but cut with an elegance that spoke of confidence earned rather than inherited. "Children are naturally eager to learn, Senator. We simply provide them with the tools and the encouragement they need to flourish." Senator Sherman nodded, making notes in his leather portfolio. "The federal government has been searching for successful models to guide our reconstruction efforts throughout the South. What you and your husband have accomplished here could serve as a template for similar schools in other regions." Near the workshop building, Edward conferred with several members of the board, their conversation animated as they examined examples of the students' work: beautifully crafted furniture, precisely sewn garments, mechanical innovations that spoke of minds trained to combine theoretical knowledge with practical application. At 34, Charlotte reflected, Edward had grown into his role as community leader with the same quiet confidence he brought to everything else. The silver at his temples had expanded, lending him an air of distinguished authority, but his eyes still held the warmth that had first drawn her to trust him. Mrs. Charlotte, Lucy Morrison, no relation to Sarah despite the shared surname, came running across the courtyard with her latest composition clutched in her small fist. At 13, Lucy had developed into one of Charlotte's most promising students, with a gift for writing that reminded Charlotte of her own youthful literary aspirations. "What have you created today, Lucy?" The girl's eyes sparkled with excitement as she unfolded her paper. "A poem about the seasons of learning. Listen, spring brings the planting of curious seeds. Summer grows them with study's care. Autumn harvests what wisdom needs. Winter rests before knowledge to share." Charlotte felt her throat tighten with emotion. These children, these bright, eager, infinitely capable children, represented more than educational success. They were living proof that her parents' sacrifice had not been in vain, that the dream of equality and opportunity they had died defending could take root and flourish in Virginia soil. "That's beautiful, Lucy. Perhaps you would share it with Senator Sherman. I believe he would enjoy hearing your perspective on education." As the afternoon progressed, Charlotte found herself in conversation with Mrs. Eleanor Cavendish, president of the Virginia Ladies Education Society, whose initial horror at Charlotte's unconventional methods had gradually transformed into grudging admiration and then enthusiastic support. "I have wonderful news," Mrs. Cavendish announced, her plump cheeks pink with excitement. "This society has voted to award you the Distinguished Service Medal at our annual gala next month. Your work here has inspired similar efforts in 3 other counties, and your teacher training program has supplied qualified instructors for schools throughout Central Virginia. Charlotte accepted the honor with appropriate gratitude, though her mind was already racing ahead to the implications. Recognition brought opportunities, but also responsibilities. Speaking engagements, consultation requests, the chance to influence educational policy on a broader scale. There is something else, Mrs. Cavendish continued, lowering her voice to a confidential tone. Senator Sherman has privately indicated that the federal government is prepared to offer substantial funding for expansion of your program, possibly including a formal teacher training college. You and Mr. Thornfield would of course maintain administrative control, but the resources could allow you to impact educational opportunities throughout the reconstructed South. The magnitude of such a possibility left Charlotte momentarily speechless. To influence the education of children across multiple states, to train teachers who would carry their methods and philosophy to communities still struggling to rebuild after the war. It was beyond anything she had dared to dream during those early, uncertain days of her marriage. As the delegation prepared to depart, Senator Sherman approached Charlotte with an expression of serious purpose. "Mrs. Thornfield, I shall be direct. Your work here represents exactly the kind of forward-thinking leadership our nation needs as we continue to heal the wounds of division. Would you and your husband consider relocating to Washington to head a national educational initiative? The salary would be substantial, the influence considerable." Charlotte felt Edward's presence before she saw him, his hand coming to rest gently at her waist in the gesture of support that had become second nature between them. She looked up into his face, seeing her own mixture of excitement and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. "It's a generous offer, Senator," Edward replied diplomatically. "Might we have some time to consider the implications? Our roots here run deep." Of course. Take all the time you need. The opportunity will remain available." That evening, as the last of their visitors departed and the academy fell quiet under the gathering dusk, Charlotte and Edward walked through the gardens where their own relationship had first begun to bloom. The late autumn air carried the scent of wood smoke and the last chrysanthemums, and Charlotte found herself thinking of cycles, how endings could become beginnings, how seeds planted in one season might not flourish until several seasons later. "What do you think?" Edward asked, as they paused beside the fountain where he had first kissed her 3 years before. Charlotte considered the question, not just the words but all the unspoken complexities it contained. "I think," she said slowly, "that we have built something beautiful here, but perhaps it's time to plant similar seeds elsewhere. Sarah is more than capable of managing the academy's daily operations, and we have trained a generation of teachers who can carry on our methods." Edward nodded thoughtfully. "The national scope would allow us to influence policy, to ensure that reconstruction efforts include genuine educational opportunity for all children, regardless of their circumstances." They had reached the center of the garden, where the gazebo stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. As they climbed the steps and settled onto the bench where they had shared so many evening conversations, Charlotte felt the profound satisfaction that came from work well done, and horizons expanding rather than contracting. "There is one more thing to consider," she said, taking Edward's hand in hers and pressing it gently against her still flat abdomen. "Our family is about to grow. Dr. Matthews confirmed it. Yesterday we should expect our first child by late spring." Edward's face transformed, with a joy so pure and complete that Charlotte felt her own eyes fill with tears. He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair, and she heard him whisper a prayer of gratitude that seemed to encompass not just this new blessing, but the entire improbable journey that had brought them to this moment. "Twins," she added softly against his ear, and felt him go perfectly still with amazement. "Twins," he repeated, leaning back to study her face in the moonlight. "Dr. Matthews seems quite certain. He says it runs in the Whitmore line. My grandmother was a twin and my great-aunt as well." They sat together in the gazebo as the night deepened around them, making quiet plans and sharing quiet hopes. The National Educational Initiative would have to wait until after the children were born and old enough to travel, but Charlotte found that she didn't mind the delay. Some things, she had learned, flourished best when given time to develop naturally, allowed to grow strong roots before being asked to bear the weight of larger purposes. The fountain murmured its gentle music, and somewhere in the darkness Charlotte heard the sound of night birds calling to their mates. Tomorrow would bring decisions to be made, letters to be written, futures to be shaped. But tonight was for gratitude, for the mysterious providence that had transformed a marriage of necessity into a partnership of love, for the children who would carry forward the values they had worked so hard to instill, for the new life growing within her that represented hope made tangible. Edward's hand was warm over hers, and Charlotte reflected on the curious mathematics of love, how it multiplied rather than divided when shared, how it grew stronger rather than weaker when tested, how it created abundance where scarcity had once reigned. The Thornfield Academy would continue to flourish under Sarah Morrison's capable guidance. The National Educational Initiative would wait for the right moment to unfold. And in the spring, 2 new Thornfields would arrive to inherit a world made slightly better by their parents' stubborn insistence that love was stronger than hatred, hope more durable than despair, and the future more promising than the past. The circle of honor continued to expand, drawing in new lives, new possibilities, new reasons to believe that redemption was not just possible, but inevitable for those brave enough to plant seeds in faith and patient enough to tend them with love. The letter arrived on a February morning when snow lay thick across the Shenandoah Valley, and Charlotte's pregnancy had begun to show in the soft rounding of her figure beneath her winter dresses. Edward brought it to her in the morning room, where she sat surrounded by correspondence from educators across the South, requesting advice, funding proposals, and copies of their curriculum materials. "This one is different," he said, his voice carrying an odd note that made Charlotte look up from her writing. The envelope bore the seal of the Virginia State Legislature, and the quality of the paper suggested official business of the highest importance. Charlotte accepted the letter with hands that had grown slightly unsteady. Pregnancy had brought unexpected moments of nervousness, as if her changing body reminded her that life was fragile, precious, not to be taken for granted. She broke the seal carefully and unfolded the heavy parchment within. "Mrs. Charlotte Whitmore Thornfield," it began in formal script, "the Commonwealth of Virginia hereby extends official recognition for your extraordinary contributions to the cause of public education and social progress." "Edward," Charlotte whispered, her voice failing as she read the unprecedented words, "they're offering me a position on the State Board of Education, the first woman ever appointed to such a position in Virginia." Edward moved to read over her shoulder, his breath warm against her ear as they absorbed the magnitude of what was being offered. The letter was signed by Governor Gilbert Walker himself, and the accompanying documents outlined responsibilities that would make Charlotte one of the most influential educational leaders in the post-war South. "The salary is substantial," Edward observed, pointing to the financial details. "More than many men earn in positions of far less responsibility." Charlotte set the letter aside and moved to the window, where she could watch the academy buildings emerging from the morning mist like promises made solid. Sarah Morrison was already there, arriving early as was her custom, smoke beginning to curl from the workshop chimneys as the older students prepared for their daily lessons in practical trades. "It would mean moving to Richmond," Charlotte said quietly. "Leaving all of this, leaving Sarah to manage alone." "Sarah is more than capable," Edward replied, joining her at the window. "And Richmond is not the far side of the world. We could maintain our involvement here while expanding our influence throughout the state." Charlotte touched her abdomen, feeling the subtle flutter that had recently begun, the first movements of the twins who would arrive in late spring. 2 babies, a new position of unprecedented responsibility, the pressure of being the first woman in such a role. Is it too much to attempt all at once? Edward was quiet for a long moment, and Charlotte could practically see him weighing possibilities, considering angles, applying the same careful analysis he brought to all significant decisions. "What does your heart tell you?" he asked finally. Her heart. Charlotte closed her eyes and listened to the subtle voice within, the one that had guided her to return to Thornfield after their first difficult conversation, that had led her to forgive Jake Morrison, that had whispered yes when Edward first asked if she might consider teaching workers' children. "My heart tells me that my parents died trying to protect people who had no other advocates," she said slowly. "That everything we've built here, the academy, our marriage, the family we're creating, has been about expanding opportunities for those who might otherwise have none. This position could allow us to influence educational policy for thousands of children across Virginia. And the challenges? The criticism you'll face as the first woman in such a position?" Charlotte smiled, feeling a familiar surge of the quiet strength that had sustained her through every major transition in her life. "I've been criticized before, for marrying above my station, for teaching workers' children, for befriending the daughter of a convicted murderer. If criticism could discourage me, I would still be living on my uncle's charity in Richmond, accomplishing nothing more significant than embroidering pillowcases and making polite conversation at tea parties. That afternoon, they walked through the academy together, Edward's hand protectively at Charlotte's elbow as they navigated the paths made slippery by melting snow. In the main classroom, Sarah was leading 23 students through a geography lesson that used their own local landscape as a starting point for understanding broader concepts of climate, agriculture and commerce. Rivers flow toward the sea, 10-year-old Marcus Washington observed, his dark face bright with curiosity as he studied the map. So the James River connects our valley all the way to the ocean, and to places beyond the ocean. Exactly right, Marcus, Sarah confirmed with the patient enthusiasm that had made her such a gifted teacher. Can you think of ways that connection might be important for farmers and merchants? Charlotte felt a surge of maternal pride watching Sarah work, not just for her teaching skills, but for the confident young woman she had become. At 19, Sarah Morrison possessed poise, intelligence, and a natural authority that commanded respect from students, parents, and visiting dignitaries alike. The frightened girl who had arrived at Thornfield 3 years before had transformed herself through education and opportunity into someone who could lead others towards similar transformations. She'll manage beautifully, Edward murmured, following Charlotte's gaze. I know, but I'll miss this, the daily contact with the children, the immediacy of watching young minds expand and grow. The state position will touch many more young minds, even if less directly. Charlotte nodded, understanding the truth of what he said while still feeling the bittersweet ache of transition. Change, even positive change, required leaving familiar places behind, stepping into unknown territory where success was possible but not guaranteed. That evening, they hosted a small dinner party for Benjamin and Mary Parker, Sarah Morrison and Dr. James Fletcher, the young professor who had become both friend and invaluable colleague. The conversation naturally turned to Charlotte's appointment, and Charlotte found herself articulating her thoughts for the first time to a group whose opinions she valued. The precedent is significant, Dr. Fletcher observed, cutting his roast beef with the precise movements that marked all his actions. If you succeed in this role, and I have every confidence you will, it opens doors for other women to participate in educational leadership throughout the South. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. The girls in our academy need to see that learning can lead to positions of real influence, not just teaching or domestic arts. Your appointment shows them that Virginia has changed, that merit rather than gender can determine opportunities. Benjamin Parker, ever practical, raised the question that Charlotte knew was troubling others. What about when the babies come? State board meetings don't pause for maternal responsibilities. Charlotte had considered this challenge extensively. I've corresponded with several women in northern states who have balanced professional responsibilities with motherhood. It requires careful organization, reliable help, and a husband who shares domestic duties more equally than Southern tradition typically expects. She looked at Edward with a smile. Fortunately, I married a man who has never been overly concerned with traditional expectations. Mary Parker laughed, the sound bright and musical in the candle-lit dining room. Mr. Edward has always been practical about getting things done, regardless of who does them or how they've been done before. As their guests departed into the winter night, Charlotte and Edward stood together on the front porch, breathing the sharp, clear air and watching stars brilliant in the cloudless sky. The babies stirred restlessly, as if responding to their mother's emotional intensity, and Charlotte placed both hands over her rounded belly. Are we making the right choice? She asked, voicing the question that had hummed beneath all evening's conversations. Edward wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting atop her head. We're making a brave choice, he replied, which is not the same thing but perhaps more important. Safe choices preserve what already exists. Brave choices create new possibilities. Charlotte leaned back against his solid warmth, feeling the familiar comfort of their physical and emotional partnership. In 18 months of marriage, they had learned to trust each other's judgment, to support each other's dreams, to find strength in their unity rather than limitation in their commitment. The twins will grow up seeing their mother in a position of influence and respect, she said, thinking aloud. Whether they're boys or girls, they'll understand that capability rather than convention should determine opportunity, and they'll grow up understanding that meaningful work often requires sacrifice and struggle, but that both can be faced successfully when partners support each other completely. A shooting star streaked across the winter sky, bright and brief and beautiful. Charlotte made a wish, not for ease or certainty, but for wisdom sufficient to the challenges ahead. for strength to honor the trust being placed in her, for grace to balance the competing demands of profession and family without losing sight of the values that had brought them this far. Tomorrow, she would write her letter of acceptance to Governor Walker. She would begin the process of transitioning her academy responsibilities to Sarah, of preparing for a move to Richmond that would test every aspect of their marriage and their shared vision for Virginia's educational future. But tonight, she stood in her husband's embrace beneath the brilliant stars, feeling their children move within her, and knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, stronger for having been tested, wiser for having been trusted with influence, more capable of love for having learned that the heart's capacity grew rather than diminished when shared generously with others. The circle of honor continued to expand, drawing in new opportunities, new responsibilities, new reasons to believe that the future could be shaped by those brave enough to reach for it. Richmond in late spring dressed itself in the soft greens and gentle warmth that made Virginia beautiful beyond description. Charlotte stood at the tall windows of the state capitol building, one hand resting on her dramatically rounded figure, watching legislators and citizens move through the grounds below with the unhurried dignity that marked the city during its finest season. At 7 months pregnant with twins, Charlotte moved with careful grace through her duties as Virginia's first female member of the State Board of Education. The role had proven every bit as challenging as she had anticipated, and every bit as rewarding. In 3 months, she had successfully advocated for increased funding to rural schools, established teacher training requirements that emphasized practical skills alongside academic knowledge, and created a system of traveling instructors who brought educational opportunities to the most remote corners of the Commonwealth. Mrs. Thornfield? Miss Rebecca Hayes, her assistant and former student from the Thornfield Academy, appeared in the doorway with a sheaf of correspondence. At 22, Rebecca possessed the quick intelligence and unshakable composure that made her invaluable in navigating the complex protocols of state government. The afternoon schedule, ma'am. Senator Morrison wishes to discuss funding for the Western County School construction project, and Governor Walker,